Hello there, you're watching News Debrief on CNN News 18. I'm Maha Siddiqui. This was really our last chance to save the planet and yes, save ourselves from the impending doom due to climate catastrophe. At the climate summit COP26 in Glasgow, it's India that has shown the way. A surprise announcement of net zero by 2070 and using 50% renewable energy by 2030. India, though, warded off intense pressure to commit to a 2050 net zero deadline, relying more on a realistic timeline that has shown that targets should be taken seriously enough to be met. Unlike the richer nations that have let the world down on climate finance that was so crucially needed at a time when the developing world, the poorer world, is facing the worst brunt of climate change and global warming already. From India to China and Europe to America, it's time we come together to save the world. Over the last couple of years, India has faced intense cyclones, from Amphan on the eastern coast to Cyclone Tote on the western. The country has been ravaged by untimely rains and flash floods from Kerala to Uttarakhand. People have had to be evacuated, leaving all their belongings behind. They've barely saved themselves from the fury of nature. This is the fallout of climate change, there before us already. Historically, it's been the developed world that has been responsible largely for the greenhouse gas emissions resulting in global warming and climate change. But the onus is now on the entire world to fight it out, and India has shown how.
Fossil fuel, India's main energy driver. India, the third largest emitter, but with a per capita energy consumption much lower than the developed world. Yet, a country still in its development phase has made a big promise to save the planet. Net zero emission by 2070.
वर्ष 2070 तक भारत नेट जीरो का लक्ष्य हासिल करेगा। दूसरा, भारत 2030 तक अपनी 50% एनर्जी रिक्वायरमेंट रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी से पूरी करेगा।
With this, the Prime Minister warded off intense pressure to commit to an unrealistic target of 2050. Prime Minister Modi explained India's stand and put out the 5 commitments the country was making at the Glasgow Climate Summit COP26. Net zero emissions target to be achieved by 2070. Increase non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030. 50% energy requirement to be met by renewable energy by 2030. Reduce carbon emission by 1 billion ton by 2030. And the country's emission intensity to be reduced by at least 45% by 2030. While India made bold commitments, it also called out the rich countries for failing to do their bit in mitigating the climate crisis.
Friends, ये सच्चाई हम सभी जानते हैं कि क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस को लेकर आज तक किए गए वायदे खोखले ही साबित हुए हैं। भारत की अपेक्षा है कि विकसित देश जल्द से जल्द $1 ट्रिलियन का क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस उपलब्ध कराएं।
Wealthy nations had promised $100 billion a year to developing nations by 2020 in the Copenhagen 2009 summit. But they did not live up to the commitment. Climate finance is money paid by rich countries which have been responsible in the past for emissions to developing countries. This to help them meet emission reduction targets. Narendra Modi, after all, has always been a fierce climate warrior. Back in 2013, Gujarat was the first to set up a separate department for climate change, accounted for nearly 30% of carbon credits earned by India. Under him as Prime Minister, India is the only country in G20 which is on the fast track to achieve climate goals. And now, Modi's commitment at COP26, one that has arguably eclipsed tall claims by world leaders like President Biden, has set a new benchmark that should push richer nations to do their bit. Bureau Report, CNN News 18.
Let's go straight now to Glasgow. Sanjay Suri is joining us with the very latest from there. Sanjay, many thanks for speaking with us. Sanjay, first of all, what have been the reactions from various countries as far as the bold commitments that have been made by India?
Well, the reactions are mixed because there was some fear that India will not set any target at all, but there is some relief, therefore, that there is a target. There is, on the other hand, some level of misgivings because the 2050 target is not being aimed at, it's been pushed back 20 years, a long spell, to 2070 as we know. But there is a further question ahead that the developed countries are not talking very much about, which is the climate financing. As the Prime Minister said, all the promises made so far have turned out to be hollow. That 100 billion a year was to have been met last year. We are nowhere there. The next target date for that is 2023. Now, if that were to be met by then, that would still be a very small fraction of what is required. The Prime Minister said it will take $1 trillion. So if we are not getting to 100 billion, it's not very likely that we're going to get to 10 times that much in the foreseeable future. And India has a fairly early target of 2030 to meet that 500 gigawatt target. There is a question now for the developed world to actually live up its promises to do far more than it has done by way of financing for climate change and, of course, the attendant issue of technology transfer.
Absolutely. Sanjay, are we likely to, at the end of it, see any concrete commitments being put out? Sanjay, are you there with us? All right, we seem to have lost our link there with Sanjay Suri, but of course he's getting us those details from Glasgow. He's talking about how the developed world clearly has lagged behind in its promise of climate finance. Now, at COP26, 100 countries have promised to end deforestation by 2030 and $19 billion have been pledged to protect and restore forests. Forests, a very vital element in keeping the air clean and cutting down on carbon dioxide. But this alone will not be enough. The world needs a greater push towards greener and cleaner. And for that, money needs to be invested. Is the developed world willing to walk the talk, or is it just empty promises again? NC Satpathy explains.
At the climate summit in Scotland called COP26 that opened on Sunday, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson summed up how very little time is left to avert catastrophic global warming.
Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It's 1 minute to midnight on that doomsday clock, and we need to act now. If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
UN Chief Antonio Guterres went a step further by reminding the world how from wildfires to heat waves to devastating floods that hit China and Germany last year, climate change continues to gravely impact the lives of billions of people across the planet.
Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
Under mounting pressure for having done very little to combat climate change so far, President Joe Biden apologized for Trump's hostility towards global climate combat. Biden set an aggressive target of cutting the emissions produced by the United States this decade by about 50% below 2005 levels.
Climate change is already ravaging the world. We've heard from many speakers. It's not hypothetical. It's not a hypothetical threat. It's destroying people's lives and livelihoods, and doing it every single day.
But the United States realizes this might not be enough. Biden is set to bring in a new law that promises to limit the methane coming out of American oil rigs. Methane, a byproduct of oil and natural gas, can warm the atmosphere to dangerous levels much more than carbon dioxide. Biden is pushing other countries to cut global methane levels by 30% by 2030. Amid the raging debate over who should be more responsible for cutting greenhouse emissions, world leaders are offering new commitments in Glasgow. The notable absentees are China and Russia, the two major greenhouse gas emitters. The absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin shows how divided the world is in its climate combat efforts. China, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, proposed a new target that is hardly any different from its past promises. And Russia is yet to make any new commitments. Coal is one of the issues dividing the rich and developing countries. While rich nations have been shutting down coal plants, Asian countries continue to use coal to meet growing demand for power. So leaders from over 100 countries have promised to end deforestation by 2030, and $19 billion have been pledged to protect and restore forests. But the big question is, will they keep their promises? There are reasons to doubt, especially after Donald Trump had infamously junked the Paris Climate Accords. With NC Satpathy, Ritangshu Bhattacharya for CNN News 18.
Samrat Sen Gupta, Program Director, Climate Change, Renewable Energy, Center for Science and Environment, is now joining us here on the show. Samrat, many thanks for speaking with us. First of all, India has decided to walk the talk with its bold commitments. But what, in your perspective, will be the challenges to achieve these targets?
There are really, the announcement is very bold and ambitious, but there are huge challenges in front of us, particularly I like to mention the 1 billion tonnage reduction by 2030. This shows roughly 22% from the business as usual scenario. And then that means the per capita emission in 2030 will be lower than all rapidly developing economy and industrialized countries, including China, including US, including European Union. This, if we can get, we are what we have earlier committed in as a part of our NDC by 30 to 35% reduction by 2030. We are well ahead in that path. So, as per our assessment in CSE, we see that 40+% is easily achievable by India by present efforts what is going on. So 45% is a progressive target that will be, I think, will be met, and we have to meet it.
All right.
India has
Samrat, I'll interrupt you there because I also want to understand from you that while countries like India are making these bold commitments, where do richer countries stand on a critical issue of climate finance? Because many of the countries across the world, developing countries, require that help as far as investment is concerned to be able to tackle emissions.
Yes, for last 3 decades, we haven't seen anything that will give us a confidence that whatever the present pledges in terms of money or even their domestic action, the developed country will be doing substantial, they will be walking the talk. Last 3 decades, it was only talk show. So even if you see the post-COVID recovery, the developed countries has spent around $15 trillion. So what is 100 billion to them for climate, which is also an existential crisis for the human civilization?
Absolutely, yes.
So after 5 years of that money being altered, we haven't seen anything flown substantially. Whatever the OECD analysis shows that almost 70% they have made, it is not at all transparent. It is the most opaque system. Even an independent analysis by Oxfam showing only 20% of that money is actually flown as a climate finance.
Shocking.
And that to a
that
diversion
commitment was till 2020 and it hasn't been lived up to. Samrat, my final question to you. India has also said that 50% of its energy will be from renewable energy sources by 2030. Are we well on track to achieve that?
We have developed our pathway to achieve those kind of target. We have initially put 175 by 2022. We will be not meeting that target, but we have achieved one already. Our installed capacity of new renewable is 101 gigawatt, If we add on hydro, it is around 150 gigawatt.
Okay.
So 450 gigawatt was our earlier target by 2030. Now, if we want to really give 50% of our energy from renewable only, the target will be massive. It will be 700 gigawatt.
All right.
So
Samrat, we'll leave it at that.
we can
We'll leave it at that. Thanks for explaining those crucial bits to our viewers as far as the commitments by India are concerned and the commitments that have not been fulfilled by the developed world are concerned. Now, from flooding in India and China to drought and wildfires in the US, this year has been witness to extreme weather conditions across the globe. Their impact is also more severe and the frequency higher. This is leading to a direct impact on human lives and livelihood. So it's time for us to act. And the IPCC report that rung the alarm bells and forced leaders to take note of the disaster in waiting tells us just that.
This UN report has gone farther than ever to squarely blame human greenhouse emissions for the climate crisis. The warming is happening even faster than scientists previously thought. And the latest projections have us reaching or exceeding 1.5 degrees within the next decade or two.
This report tells us that each of the past 4 decades has been the warmest on record since pre-industrial times. Further, it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. Human influence is making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. What's new in this report is that we can now attribute many more changes at the global and regional level to human influence.
Here's how warming temperature can affect weather events. Heat waves are already about 5 times more likely to occur with our current warming of just over 1 degree Celsius. Extreme heat waves such as the one that occurred in the Pacific Northwest and Canada earlier this summer will be commonplace. At 2 degrees warming, the frequency of heat waves increases to 14 times. The hottest temperatures will be nearly 3 degrees higher than previous heat waves. The frequency and severity of droughts will increase. Droughts like the one currently plaguing the western United States, that used to occur on average once a decade, are now occurring 70% more frequently. If warming continues to 2 degrees, these droughts will occur between 2 and 3 times as often. More intense evaporation will lead to more droughts. Warmer air can hold more water vapor to produce extreme rainfall, as we saw in Germany and China. On average, the frequency of heavy downpours has already increased by about 30% and they contain about 7% more water. Hurricanes are growing stronger and producing more rain as global temperatures increase. Simply put, the warmer the air is, the more moisture it can hold and the more rain it produces. A higher percentage of storms are already Category 3, 4 and 5 storms. Sea levels are rising around the world, worsening flooding and storm surges. By the year 2100, once-in-a-century coastal flood events will occur at least once per year at more than half of coastlines across the world. Climate change is not just increasing the severity of extreme weather, but will also cause weather whiplash, wild swings between dry and wet extremes. This has been experienced recently in California, with destructive floods one year and extreme drought the next. Some changes, though, are irreversible. Even under the lowest emission scenarios, climate changes that have already happened due to warming will persist even if emissions stop and temperatures stabilize. With Natasha Menden, Swarlipi Sengupta for CNN News 18.
Taking a very quick break now. Up next, God's own country, Kerala, continues to face the brunt of climate change and how. More on that in a bit. Stay with us. Welcome back. For the past 4 years since the flood mayhem in 2018, Kerala has been witnessing adverse weather conditions. Climate change and the change in land use at the Western Ghats have been seen as the main factors. Neetu Regukumar gets us this report. This October, 59 lives were lost. Of this, 23 were due to landslides. 70 lives were lost in a landslide in 2020 in the state's Idukki district. In August 2019, 129 lives were lost across the state in flood and landslides. And in 2018, Kerala witnessed one of its worst floods in history, claiming 399 lives in the month of August alone. Clearly, nature has not been kind to God's own country.
Without any scientific study in the slopes, we are making infrastructural changes. After 2018, the government has started checking what is happening in the Western Ghats. Then only they have started.
Why is this happening? Experts say it's all an effect of global warming and climate change. The change in land use pattern along the Western Ghats is also a major reason for the landslides.
Bring about a land use policy. Neither at the state level nor at the national level we have a land use policy. Kerala especially is the state which has the maximum number of ecologically sensitive zones in India.
Experts also say that the state needs to come up with location-specific disaster management plans at the ward level. The need for more stringent environmental regulations to be brought in and implemented strictly is rising. The Kerala State Disaster Management Plan in 2018 identified 14.4% of the state as landslide prone. The state government has mapped the landslide prone areas in the state and is trying to relocate people from vulnerable areas.
It is an exercise that we have carried out across the state. It covers all districts and especially the Ghats. So wherever the slope is high and wherever there is chances of high precipitation, there are about 7,000 locations where some sort of relocation we have assessed. In fact, the government has a program wherein 10 lakhs are given. 6 lakhs for finding new ground, safer locations, and then 4 lakhs for building their house.
The impact of climate change, land use pattern of Western Ghats are all visible in Kerala for the past 4 years. Kerala being ecologically sensitive, development should be done keeping in mind climate change. It's a long way ahead, but the only way forward is through sustainable development. With video journalist Ablash MS in Thiruvananthapuram, Neetu Raghukumar.
And as the world watches the leaders in Glasgow make promises, the big question is, will they live up to the commitments to mitigate the woes of the vulnerable population? That's it for today. See you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.